Welcome, friends, to this episode of the Sync Your Life podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Celeste Holbrook. She is a sex expert, and I can't wait to dive into our conversation today. I've had the great fortune of listening to her being interviewed on other podcasts, so I'm familiar with her story and what she has to share. And I think this is a topic that we really need to hear. I can't believe that we're 80 some episodes into the podcast, and we've not dedicated a single one yet to the topic of sex. We do talk about sex hormones. We talk about women's menstrual health. We talk about this feeling of hormone imbalance and what we can do about it and how to cycle sync. But today we're stopping, we're pausing, and we're saying, no, let's take a look at our sex life, right? Let's take a look at our intimacy, our physical touch. This is all super important in the realm of hormone health and in just life in general. So she's the perfect person to have on. I was referred to her by Leslie Logan of the Be It Till You See It podcast. So shout out to Leslie for the referral. But I can't wait to dive into what we're going to talk about. We had a chance to connect prior to this, and I wanted to keep going in that conversation. I had so many things that I wanted to talk about. So let's go ahead and dive in. So Dr. Celeste, welcome to the show. Please, if you would, just tell our audience who you are, a little bit about your story, and how you got to doing what you're doing.
Hi, Jenny. Thank you so much for having me on. It's such a pleasure. And I feel delighted to be connecting with your audience today. Please just refer to me as Celeste. I'm Celeste. I do have a PhD in health education with a postgraduate emphasis in sex and sexual behavior. I started in this work because I grew up in a really conservative small town in Texas, and the message that was given to me was I needed to wait until I was married to have penetrative sex. So, being the very good girl that I was, I waited until I was married to have penetrative sex, and it was terrible. It was very painful. I realized over time when I was trying to get things sorted that the messaging that I had gotten growing up was causing vaginismus. So vaginismus being when your vaginal canal kind of shuts down and your body is essentially trying to keep you safe from this thing that it had learned over time in my small community that was going to hurt me. I've been told messages my whole life that sex was going to hurt me. So my body was just trying to keep me safe. And so sex was really painful for the first full year of marriage. And it caused a whole bunch of other things like resentment and shame. And I felt angry towards my partner. And so after a year, I went to an OB-GYN who did a full examination and said, Celeste, I don't think there's anything wrong with you. I think you just need to have a baby. And so, which is terrible advice. It's terrible, terrible advice. Babies don't fix your sex life.
That is the worst advice I think I've ever heard.
It's really terrible. And to give you some context, this OB-GYN was the same OB-GYN that had actually delivered me into the world. It was my mom's OB-GYN. So just to give you a little bit of context of, what that might have looked like. So I took matters into my own hands. I was already studying health behaviors. And so I thought, there's just got to be something I'm missing. So I really started studying sexuality. And when I tell you that sex education saved my relationship, I don't feel I'm being bombastic, because giving myself the sex education that I never got growing up helped my body to understand sex as something that was okay and safe and eventually pleasurable. And eventually I was able to move through vaginismus to the other side of sex. So sex became neutral at first and then pleasurable. So that's why I got into sex education, because it was very intimately involved in my own life. And I saw, I thought if I could help, myself, there's probably one other person out there who's dealing with this thing that maybe I could help. I have this degree in health education. I'm understanding sexuality and sexual behavior more in depth. Maybe I can help. So I opened my own practice in 2013, and I worked for a sex toy company for a while as a sex educator, and then I started my own practice when my twins were born via C-section, by the way, not vaginally. So that's how we're here. That's how I got into what I do now, and I feel very privileged and lucky to be able to do it.
So obviously, my first question has to be this, because when you opened your own practice and you kind of started going in this direction, I have to assume that you found more than one person who maybe had a similar experience, right? And that's why you are still here where you are. So I'd love to hear, and this is something that I had written down for myself to ask you. And it's something that I want to make sure we call attention to on the show, because as a woman who also educates about women's hormone health and menstrual health, I find that menstrual health is something that women just don't talk about, right?
Mhm.
Painful periods, we just assume, well, this is just what we have to do, right? Or migraine headaches, I think it's just me, it must just be me. Like, it's not something that we talk about in our circles, right? The
Right.
same thing goes for sex. I can only think maybe of a couple of conversations I've ever had with a girlfriend on the topic of sex. So my question for you is, what is it about the topic of sex that keeps women from talking about it? Like, what is it that keeps women from making this an everyday conversation?
That's such a great question because I think that we are not ever taught or modeled how to talk about sex or even how to have sex. If you think about every other behavior, with maybe the exception of, our menstruation, but every other behavior we are modeled, like we are given a model of relationship as we're growing up in our households with our caregivers. Might not be a great one, but we are modeled relationship behavior. We are modeled driving behavior. We are modeled eating behavior. Granted, all those have a spectrum of healthy and unhealthy that we are modeled. We are never modeled sexual behavior that is not performed for us. So, yes, we're modeled sexual behavior on porn or in media, but that's really it. And certainly nobody's telling us, here's how you have conversations with your partner or with your friends about sex to normalize some of these things that happen to most people. Nobody's having that conversation with us or have not historically had that conversation with us. When sex is something like eating and menstruation that so many of us have in common, and yet we are never given the permission, the modeling, the learned behavior of having those conversations. So that's why I think it happens. I think it's getting better because we are kind of breaking that as certainly moms and women, we are starting to talk about it more because we realize that, for instance, things like shame around body and sex die in the light. And so the more that we can talk about them, shame around your period, shame around your vulva, those are all real life things that happen, but they die when that shame becomes less when we talk about it in community, right? We heal in community. So I think we're getting better about it. And there's a lot of opportunity to get more in depth in these conversations, which is why, Jenny, that I love that you're having this conversation on your podcast, because you and I can model having a conversation about sex so that somebody can listen to it and go, okay, this is some language I could use. These are some questions I could talk about with my girlfriends or my partner or my OB, right? So I think this is just the way we model sexual conversations.
I'm just curious, based on your experience and what you do, what would you say, like, how many women, I don't want to, you don't have to give me like a set percentage, but how many women do you think are suffering through sex? How many do you think are
Mm-hmm.
enjoying it regularly? And how many do you think are suffering through it?
Wow, I can't put a number on that. We do have some statistics around pain. We know that around 52% of women experience pain at some point in their life around sex. But what's very frustrating to me is when you go to the OB-GYN, typically, unless they've talked to me and I force them to change their intake paperwork, typically you're being asked, do you have pain with sex? And not, do you experience pleasurable sex? You're being asked, do you have pain or do you have low libido? Right? Those are the typical intake forms. And typically nobody's asking, are you thriving in your sex life? They're just asking, are you surviving? Are you able to have sex without pain or whatever? So that research and data is really hard. It's hard to gather because nobody's asking the right questions. Are you having fun in your sex life? Do you know your tools for arousal? Do you feel comfortable asking for what you want, need, and desire? Like those are things that we're just not good at asking yet.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because when I launched my course in 2020 and women started hopping in, I would say most of them were interested because they wanted to learn why they were feeling off, right? Like their
Mm-hmm.
I always like to say their check engine lights were flashing, but they didn't understand why. it wasn't until I really got to know these women and really started working with them more individually through the course that I noticed that a lot of them were struggling in their sex life. A lot of them would finally open up and say, sex is really painful,
Mm.
or why am I so dry down there? Right. Or um, some even in the realm of my marriage is falling apart. I don't find my spouse sexy anymore, or I'm not attracted to them anymore.
Mhm.
Is it our relationship or is it me? Right? Like, am I dealing, is there an imbalance here? And so I started to really get these questions, and it was interesting because, again, it took a process to get to that point, right? Like, a lot of
Mhm.
women would start off just wanting to uncover this for themselves, and then once they felt comfortable, it was like, well, actually, let me open up and just share with you
Right.
like what's really happening. And then just recently, I was on a phone call with one of the women who has taken the course and who has successfully gotten to like the root cause of what's going on for her. She was severely progesterone deficient. She was living in estrogen dominance. She was extremely moody. She was dealing with PMS symptoms. She was sort of this, I'll say head case. She felt like a head case, right? She felt like she was just going insane on a cyclical basis. And her marriage was suffering as a result of it. And she wasn't feeling in the mood, right? Her libido
Right.
was low. And just through supplementation and adjusting like lifestyle changes. It was funny because we had a phone call with her. We were actually friends with them, and we did a Zoom call with them about something completely unrelated. And she said, "Oh, while we have you on here, I just wanted to say Jason wants to thank you. My husband wants to thank you for saving our marriage, because this is totally changing how I feel, like from a sexual perspective." So I'd love to touch on that too. I mean, this is obviously a podcast that women listen to hear more about hormone health. So what would you say, like, if a hormone imbalance is at play, right, which it could certainly be, what kinds of things could women be experiencing?
Yeah. And I will preface this by saying I'm a behaviorist. So any hormone related issues I'm referring out. So people come to me because like, okay, here's my baseline. Here's what I'm experiencing. I've seen the specialist about my hormones. And so what can I do with this that I have right now? Um, and so almost every client that I see come in, we first take an assessment of what they want to be feeling in sex, not what do they want to be doing, not how much sex they want to be having, but what do you actually want to feel? Because that drives what we do in sex. Our emotion, it drives all of our behaviors. I want to feel calm, so I pet my dog. I want to feel free, so I go for a bike ride, right? So I want to feel erotic, wild, connected, intimate. What are the things that you want to feel in sex? And so then we build a sex life around those things. Most of the information we get about sex starts with behavior first. 10 tips to make your toes squirm or whatever it is, right? We start with behavior first, and then we say this will make you feel this, when in reality we have to understand what we want to feel first and then build a behavior around that. And so if somebody's coming into the practice and saying, I just feel like I have really low libido, we talk about like, well, what does that really mean? And who decided what was low libido and what was high libido? And why don't we say that your partner has hyper libido, right? Nobody ever says that. No, it's always the low libido person's issue, right? So we do a little reframing around what it means to have low libido. What it means for most people is we're having arguments about how much sex we're having. And underneath that is really we're not connecting in a way that feels good for both of us. So we really just get to the root of like, it's not about, you could have, sex 3 times a day for the rest of your life and still be disconnected if you are not doing what it takes to feel what you want to feel. So we do a little level setting on what they're coming in for. Everybody kind of wants a quick fix, and you've probably, you know, seen this too in your practice. Tell me what to take so we can stop having conflict is really what they're saying, even though they're not saying that. What do I do so we can stop having conflict? And so we just level set in that way. And I love it when people bring their partners. I love couple sessions. That's the best way to go because everybody can learn together how we both figure out how to get what we both need out of sex. And it's often not more sex, it is better sex, more quality sex.
Yeah, the piece of connection is so huge, and that's where I want to go to next is, I was listening to something else recently, and it was on the topic of marriage and sex, and it was talking about how women, especially by nature, require more intimacy, and this sort of deeper level of connection. Obviously, men do too, but in order to get to that state of arousal, a lot of times there does need to be a connection, right? There needs to be some form of intimacy that happens beforehand a lot of the time. When I was listening to this, it was interesting because it was a cycle syncing expert talking about just the changes in your menstrual cycle and how there are times of your cycle you maybe, have a stronger libido around ovulation, whereas, heading up toward your period, when things start to flatline, you might not see that libido as much, right? So understanding our body and the ebbs and flows of our menstrual cycle can help us kind of determine when am I
Yes.
most likely to be in the mood, as opposed to most likely to be ready for some Netflix and right and chill
Right.
out. And so listening to this person, it made total sense. It made sense and I see this and I hear this often from the women that I lead, which is, my husband wants to get right to it. Like he's, maybe it's hyper arousal, maybe he's just wanting more sex or whatever the case is. And they just don't feel into it at the beginning. And so they want more of like a connection piece beforehand, right? Like whether it's a date night or a deep conversation or whatever. So I'd love to hear your perspective on, talking more in detail about this connection piece.
So I will preface this by saying as somebody who believes we're socially conditioned for most things, remember that men are socially conditioned that to lean towards sex for connection, and women are socially conditioned over time to lead towards conversation for connection. That's just the socialization we're given from day one. Men are sexual, women are relational, right? And that doesn't mean that's how you are born. That is up for debate, but it does mean that this is what you're kind of the package deal that you're kind of given. And so understanding for both partners in a heterosexual relationship that if, I as a man lean toward feel better and more connected once we've had sex, and I as a woman feel like I need some connection first before I can feel vulnerable enough for sex. Talk about that. Like, talk about what each of you need to feel connected. Do I need some vulnerable conversation? Okay. Do I need some talk during date night, like what you're saying? That's great. That's totally fine. It's not everybody, not every woman is like that, not every man is like this, but if you can know that's how you're built, then you can just build that in, right? I always say that the next sexual experience starts right at the end of this sexual experience. Like we're always working towards connection or working away from connection. And so if that means, one of the biggest killers of libido actually for women, and for a lot of people, is responsibility. And because women carry more cognitive and emotional load in the household, typically, that tends to interrupt the levels of arousal more than almost anything else. And so how can we build a life together where, she is carrying a little less of the cognitive and emotional load of the household, so that she can show up in eroticism with her whole self? Because eroticism is like the opposite of responsibility. Eroticism is curious and wonderment and a little wild and a little healthy sense of irresponsibility, right? It is a letting go, whereas responsibility is tight, and it is specific, and it is, held down. So moving from that responsibility space to the erotic space for women can be just difficult, because we have been socialized to believe we need to carry more of the emotional load of the household, the cognitive load of the household. We're the ones who know what brand of toilet paper to get. It's not just that we are the ones often getting the toilet paper, because often that physical labor is shared quite equally among partners, but we are the ones who know which kid likes which types of carrots. And so that in and of itself is one of the biggest impediments to connection and to sex for a lot of heterosexual households.
Yeah. Yeah. So good. So good. And I'm wondering too, like what kind of tips would you have for someone, for a woman in particular, who wants to know more about like, what is the best way to communicate with my spouse about sex? Like if I'm feeling like I'm not pleasured, right? If someone's listening and they're like, I don't feel like I'm pleasured, or it's, I mean, I've been in conversations before where I was at a lunch date with a group of girlfriends. And when we were leaving the lunch date, one of the friends was like, oh, I have to go home and my husband's home for lunch hour and he's going to expect sex. And it was like,
Mm.
it made us all so sad because it was like,
Mm.
ooh, like that sounded awful. But I think it's common. I think there's a lot of times where women maybe are not communicating, or mutually, man too, like not communicating their dissatisfaction, or and
Mhm.
not, like you said before, not necessarily about the quantity of sex, but about the
Yeah.
quality of sex. So my question for you is, how do we best communicate with our spouse or significant other, whether it's during sex itself
Mhm.
or when sex isn't happening? How do we talk to them about sex?
Yeah. One of the best ways is to figure out what you both want emotionally, like that conversation we had earlier about, hey, what is it that you want to feel in sex? Which is this question is a little easier to access for women a lot of times because we're used to speaking about our emotions, and a little harder to access for men. I don't know what I want. I want pleasure, so being able to have that conversation first can be helpful, and then start having a conversation of, okay, well, what would help you give or get more pleasure or whatever. But as far as specifically asking for more of what you want, here is where women typically have to do a little bit more work to understand what it is that they like and desire, right? We are not conditioned to touch our vulvas like penis owners are conditioned to touch their penises from the very beginning. When we're potty training, kids with penises, like, grab your penis, point it towards the toilet, like shoot the Cheerio. And with kids with vulvas, where sit down, use toilet tissue, and we're just not conditioned from the very beginning to be comfortable touching our own vulvas. And so if you want better pleasure in sex, it is your responsibility to understand your body and how to give yourself pleasure, which can be very daunting for a lot of people, especially if you grew up in church and maybe masturbation wasn't something that was ever encouraged for you. But it is actually not your partner's responsibility to know what you like. It is their responsibility, once you've asked them, like, hey, can you do this? It's their responsibility to engage with that conversation and say, yes, I can, no, I can't. But it is not their responsibility to just magically know what you like and what you don't like. That is something that you have to explore on your own, touching your vulva, using, trying a toy on your own in the shower with a shower head. Like, figure out what feels good to you so then you can communicate to them. But just waiting around and hoping, that they're going to figure it out is just, it's I can't, abdicating your responsibility, and so my biggest takeaway is learn what you like, learn what you like, what you don't like, and then you can start figuring out how to ask for those things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of times, I think about Brene Brown talks about, of course, she's always talking about shame and this concept of shame. And I heard her speak one time about an argument that she had with her spouse, and hearing you share this makes me think of that, because she talked about how essentially at the end of this argument, they weren't really sure what they were arguing over, but at the end of the day, she had a story in her head that was different than the story that was in his head, right? And how true is that when it comes to sex? Like, first of all, I mean, we haven't said it yet, but I think it goes without saying that society, television, right? Like things that we see, even books that we read, put out this sense of like hot sex, like this, right? And then you get into the moment. I know for me, and I just have to share this, like shower sex is almost never what you see on TV, right? Like, let's just say what it is. Like,
Amen.
will someone please just identify that? Like,
Yes.
okay, first of all, if it's anything like my house, the shower gets cold too
Small.
fast. Like, that's not fun, right?
No.
Like, anyways, we're not going to get into that full speed, but regardless, like I think we see sex on TV, and we assume that it's going to be this like hot saucy thing, when really it takes effort. It takes understanding your body. It takes knowing what you want and what feels good and being able to share that.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a question regarding, I wanted to come back. Sorry, I got distracted there. Coming
Shower
back to this,
sex, distracted.
yes, shower sex. They got me distracted. So coming back to this Brene Brown thing, though, this idea of shame, she talks about how the story in your head is different than the story in my head, right?
Yes.
if we're not sharing that, if we're not saying like this, this doesn't feel good, or this does feel good, or maybe try this, like we're not verbally saying that, and we're just assuming that like you said, we're putting the ownership on the significant other to figure out what feels good for us without communicating back. That's the same thing. That's like it's almost like an argument without being an argument. You know what I mean? And so of course there's dissatisfaction there. So I love that. I want to ask you about sex toys in particular. When I first started following you on Instagram, one night I was scrolling my Instagram sitting on the couch. My husband walked up behind me to hand me a drink, and the first image on my Instagram was you with a sex toy, and he like turns his head and looks at me like, oh, and I'm like, oh, I'm interviewing her on the podcast. Like, I think he got excited. So I wanted to hear from you. What tell us about sex toys, because I think this is something that again a lot of women are maybe hesitant to, or they don't understand.
Yeah. So the first thing I'll kind of say, like in general, any adult toy that you get, its only job is to help you feel novel sensations. So novel sensations is the only job. The same way that you might want to wear some lingerie, this lace feels nice on your skin or feels a certain way, or same way you might get some beautiful sheets on your bed. It feels good on your skin. It feels good when you're laying in there, right? So think about how sex is really a utilization of almost all of your senses, and lots of times all of your senses all at once. And so sex toys just help bring in novel sensations. So sometimes they are, vibration sensations like a clitoral vibrator. Sometimes they are cooling sensations like an arousal cream. Sometimes there are flavored sensations like flavored lubricant. So that's all that's happening, is they're bringing novel sensations, because novelty fuels arousal. Novelty fuels arousal. And so when you have novel sensations, you can feel more arousal in sex. So if you've never had a sex toy before and you are a clitoris owner, the best place to start is a clitoral vibrator. They look like bullets. They're small. They typically don't look like penises. They look sometimes the size of like a lipstick tube. And what you're going to do is you're just going to start out on your thighs and get used to how the vibration feels, maybe even with your leggings on or your underwear on. And then you kind of move up towards your vulva. You move up towards your clitoris. Your clitoris is just above your urethra, where your urine exits your body. And just kind of get used to what the vibrations feel like. You might not like it directly on your clitoris, and that's okay, but you might like it in the folds of your labia or whatever. Okay. So, and then other toys, if you like vaginal penetration, which, just to give you some data, 62% of vulva owners have their first and most of their orgasms through clitoral stimulation. So that means external stimulation. But if you like internal stimulation, you can get vibrators that are more like penis sized, and they can go inside your vaginal canal and vibrate inside the vaginal canal. So if you're just starting out, a clitoral vibrator is the way to go. Remember that they're just novel sensations. I work for the Velvet Box. I'm their health educator, and one of the biggest questions that comes into the store when people are buying their first toy is, well, my penis can't vibrate. Is she going to want the sex toy over my penis? And the answer is no, right? Because you cannot ever replace intimacy with a toy, right? The toy is just giving you different sensations, but the intimacy can only be created by two human beings. At least for now. I don't know. AI is getting pretty fantastic. I don't know. Maybe in the future, there'll be AI sex toys that can replace humans. But for now, you cannot replace intimacy with a toy. So starting out, you try a clitoral vibrator, or a vaginal vibrator that you can use on your clitoris and your vaginal canal. But then you can kind of branch out into things like male masturbator sleeves, cock rings. There's all kinds of things out there. But if you're just getting started, a little clitoral vibrator is the way to go.
Yeah, good information to know. So I also wanted to ask this question. I think it was the same podcast that I was listening to with a different sex expert talking about things that you can do in your sexual experience to elevate or heighten your arousal as a female. And one of the things that they mentioned, which was new to me, I had not heard of it before, was I believe they called it edging, this idea of edging to get to the orgasm. Is that something you're familiar with? And is that something that you recommend as well?
Yeah, and so edging can feel really great for some people. It can feel really obnoxious for other people. So the idea is that you do whatever you like to do, however you like to be touched, and you get really close to an orgasm and then you back off. And then once you're kind of at a plateau stage again, you edge up closer to that orgasm and then you back off. So it can make your orgasm eventually a little more strong. It can teach you how to have multiple orgasms because you're used to being in a heightened state for longer. But yeah, that's definitely something that can increase pleasure for a lot of people. So, using your toy to get close and then taking it away and then getting it close again and taking it away. And penis owners can do this too, after they have an erection, using your hand or with penetration or whatever, getting close to ejaculation and then stopping. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think, I think there's so much to be learned, right? Like there's so much, again, it comes back to this idea of like sex education. I mean, I've said it so many times on this podcast, right? Like when people come into the course or they come into my sphere and they start learning like that their body might not actually be ovulating, that their body might not actually be textbook, right? Of what we learned in seventh grade. Like, and like you said, we're not familiar with what all is down there. I have two little girls. I have two little girls under the age of 6. And so they're, it's interesting as you see, especially as a toddler, you see them sort of start to learn about their bodies. And you think to yourself, like, wow, no one really ever talked to me about this, right? Like I saw a textbook picture of what my female anatomy looks like, and I'm just supposed to know what to do, right? Of course it takes exploration. Of course it takes learning more and experimenting with different things. One thing that I know we had talked about when we had previously connected, and I wanted to make sure we brought it to this show as well, is this idea of, I don't know what word I want to use, but just body consciousness, self-image, body positivity, whatever direction you want to go with it, right? Like I see this and I hear about this often. I just had a woman recently who had reached out actually through the Facebook group associated with my course. And I love that the women in there feel so comfortable that they can ask whatever questions they want, which is great. But she asked the question, is it just me, or like I can't find myself comfortable enough to have sex with the lights on? That was a question that she asked. And that was something that her husband was asking for. And she was, very self-conscious, very sort of insecure, and maybe, afraid of what he might think or see. And she was like, we've always had sex with me having a shirt on or with me having the lights off. And I think this is common. Like it was interesting, the number of women that were commenting on that post and that were familiarizing. So I want to make sure we address it, because I think as a health and fitness coach, as someone who helps women become more confident in their bodies and help them understand their body more, I think it's important that we touch on this.
Yeah. And I really appreciate that you touch on this too, because I think so, I mean, can we say 100% of probably people, and specifically women, feel uncomfortable in their body at times. Maybe it's not all the time, but maybe it is when you're totally naked and vulnerable. Like, so I know this, but we could have a whole semester long conversation about body neutrality. In this moment, let's just talk real quickly about how, number one, you don't have to do anything you don't want to do. If you don't want to have sex with the lights on, and that's a hard limit for you, meaning like, I just don't see this changing for me, that is okay. You can have sex with a candle lit, a soft candle. You can keep a big oversized, maybe your partner has big oversized button down shirt, and you can unbutton the middle. So there's like a little exposure, but you feel more covered up than if you were naked, right? There's just ways around finding that balance of, I want to, feel the pleasure of pleasing my partner visually and also feeling comfortable, right? Because if you don't feel comfortable, or if you feel like pressure during sex is not going to go well for you. It might go well for your partner, but that's not the intimacy that you're probably looking for. We want it to go well for both of you. And so what I call these kind of activities that we do to feel better, I call them harm reduction activities. So I don't have sex with the lights fully on. I just have sex with a candle on. That way there's some soft glow and, you can see outlines, but I don't feel totally exposed like I'm in a dressing room with fluorescent lights, right? The reason I call them harm reduction activities is because the harm has been done by society that tells us, especially women, that your body is not sexual enough. Right? And that's bullshit, because your body is sexual because it can experience pleasure. If you can experience pleasure in some way, shape, or form, even the pleasure of your partner brushing their hand down your wrist, you are a sexual being. Okay. We're all built for pleasure. Now, whether we can access it or not is our job, but we are built for pleasure. So society has given this norm that our bodies aren't sexual enough. And the society has given this message through media and through advertising and through a kind of like a male gaze of advertising, right? I love that song, the one song about Victoria's Secret, how, the Victoria's Secret is that Victoria's Secret was Lex Wessner, a man who created this, entity that told us all that we were not thin enough, right? So think about these activities as harm reduction activities and work towards neutrality. You do not have to love your body. You really actually don't. That might be too far of an ask. I hope you love parts of your body. I do, but you can harm reduce for the rest of the shit. You can put on the lingerie that makes you feel good because it covers up some piece that society keeps on telling you is not okay, right? So find neutrality around what you can, love what you can, and harm reduce the rest and feel the pleasure. So the second piece of this is harm reduction is first and pleasure is second in terms of anchoring into your sensations, right? Because sex is not about how you look. It really, really is not. Sex is about how you feel, what you experience, the sensations you're having. How does your clitoris feel right now? What does the fan feel like blowing on your butt? What do your nipples feel like when they're being sucked or licked? How do you feel when your partner is topping you and pulling your hair? Like, how do you feel? That is what we're getting out of sex, not what you look like. It's my absolute soapbox, Jenny.
Yes, I know. I'm so glad I asked the question because I'm like making a mental note for myself that that's our mic drop moment. That's so good though. And you're so right. Like, I think I told you when we talked previously, I remember when this person asked the question in the Facebook group, somebody else commented and wrote, "You're the only one worried about it. I assure you that he's going to be turned on no matter what." Right? Like, we seem to focus so much sometimes on like, oh, but my lower belly or my arms or this or whatever, right? Like exactly what you were just saying. We let society dictate the sexiness of you have to look like a Victoria's Secret model in order to feel a certain way. And it's, in reality, again, it kind of comes back to like the man or the significant other that you're having sexual relations with, man or woman, can be, they can be just totally aroused in the moment and by you and the intimacy, and has nothing to do with your lower belly or your arms or whatever you're thinking about in your own head. Right. So I love this. I love that. And I just think, I always think to myself, and my grandma used to always say, she would make jokes about her body, and it was always so funny because she loved to cook, right? She was like the pork loin and gravy Sunday dinner grandma, and she used to make comments and say things. She'd be like, and she'd kind of pat her belly and she'd be like, I need to lose some weight, and then she'd say, nobody's gonna care when I'm in my casket. And that was always her joke. And it's like, I think of it so much though, like in all reality, like, you're going to take that beautiful Victoria's Secret body to the grave. Like, okay, cool. Like, you want to be healthy. You want to be fit. You want to feel good, right? It's about feeling good. And let's please change the language. Let's change the language from what you look like to how you feel, right? Let's measure everything in your energy. And the same thing goes for sex too.
Yes, absolutely.
I want to ask this question, and it's all intertwined, of course, with what we've been talking about, but for those who are in a relationship, how can we, I was listening to, I think it was Shalene Johnson talking about this recently on her show. She was talking about how it oftentimes takes intention, right? Intentional effort to create an excitement around sex
Mm.
outside of that moment of sex? You mentioned earlier the next sexual experience starts when the last one ends, right?
Mm.
She talked about texting with her husband, right?
Right.
Creating like you could call it like tease material, right? Like
Yeah.
different things that she's utilizing to really make the both of them excited or to look forward to. I
Yeah.
also know there are people out there that swear by making it a priority so much as to put it on the calendar, like making
Sure.
sure that it's, not to say like, oh, it's our Tuesday night sex night or whatever,
Right.
but just making it more of a focus. So how would you say, like from a relationship angle, how can you make sex a priority in a relationship, and how can you make it something that's exciting when you're not in that moment? How can you kind of lead up to it?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm often talking to couples about is to create intentional sexuality. And so this is kind of a blend of, it's not scheduled sex, it's not, sex every Tuesday like you're going to the dentist, but it is like, let's talk about, just like we talk about the business of marriage, just like we talk about, here are the bills we need to pay this week, or this is thing that's coming up, we need to schedule some childcare. Let's talk about sex in those terms. Like, hey, you and I are both off work on Thursday and home. Like, what if we carve out an hour for some sex or just sexual experiences or some intimate time, right? So it's typically not something that we do because we are taught that sex or good sex is spontaneous, and that is a myth. Good sex is not spontaneous. Good sex is anticipated, right? If you think about when you were first having sex with your partner, you're like, ooh, I'm going over to his house on Thursday to play Scrabble. I must shave my legs because, and like you think like, oh, when we were first together, we had all that spontaneous sex. No, you didn't. You were thinking about it because things were new and fun. You were definitely thinking about sex before sex happened. You were anticipating it, and it felt spontaneous because it was less difficult to get into than it is now in a long-term relationship. Yes, sex is harder to get into for most of us after we've been in relationship for a while, and that is just okay. But you can create intentionality and anticipation around sex that makes sex good. So if you say like, okay, we're going to carve out this hour or whatever on Thursday to get in the shower together and see where things go, and maybe they don't go farther than that, and that's okay, but you have planned on some sensual time together. And to add on to this, what works really well for a lot of people is planning off days too. So if we are planning on intentional kind of sexuality on Thursday, take it off of anybody's mindset on Wednesday. Because what happens for so many people, and so many of your listeners are going to recognize this, is that when sex is always supposed to be an option, you start to move away from your partner. Okay. So they're like behind you in the dishwasher and they like give you a little squeeze on your shoulder and you move away because you are not feeling like sex and you don't want to give into any idea that you are ready for sex. Right. And this is very common. And what you're missing out on is affection. So we're missing out on affectionate touch because we are worried we will have to make it erotic. So when you take sex off the table, you actually lean more into affection. Let's just sit here on the couch and Netflix and hold hands. Let me drape my leg around your leg because that feels really good to me. And I know that it's not going to go erotic because affectionate touch is just as connective, just as important as erotic touch. But when we are so worried that it's going to go erotic, we miss out on affection. So one of the things that I'm encouraging you to do is to make off days for sex as well. Like, we're not going to try and have sex on Wednesday. It's a tough day for all the kids. It's a tough day for us. Like, let's just connect affectionately and hold those boundaries. And then you have a more balanced, blended approach to your intimacy.
Yeah. Yeah. So good. I have a couple of things that I want to make sure we touch on. One is, and you're making me think of this as you're speaking, because I'm a huge fan of one of the first things my husband and I did when we first got married. We were part of this church group, and the church group read the book, The Five Love Languages.
Mm-hmm.
And the five love languages, I've now also read the children's version to see what love languages my children have as well. highly recommend. I'll link it up in the show notes if you guys haven't read it. But I learned so much about my spouse. This was in our first year of marriage through reading that book together. And through taking the quiz and reading through it all, it made total sense. And he is still to this day a physical touch love language. And it doesn't always have to be sex, right? Like
That's correct.
He wants me to sit with him on the couch. He doesn't want me to sit 3 feet apart. He wants me to drape my legs over him. He wants me to get under a blanket with him. He wants to, like, that's his love language. Yep. And he wants to walk by me at the dishwasher and rub my shoulders. Like, he wants to do that sort of thing. And that's how he shows affection. And I think physical touch might have been my last love language. Like it's not as important to, like, I'm not a hugger, right? But even when I see a girlfriend, my first inclination isn't to just run up and hug them or hold their hand. Like, that's just not my style. So for me, that was such a pivotal moment, even in our marriage. We'd been together since high school. We were high school sweethearts, but understanding and knowing, like, this is how he feels loved helps me so much with making that an intentional effort. And instead of backing away and saying, oh, I hate this, like, cause it's not me, saying, okay, this is how he feels loved. And then vice versa, right? My love language is acts of service. So when he, decides to vacuum the rug spontaneously without me asking, like, it's a very hot thing. Like, it's like, oh, like he's mowing the grass. He's doing things around the house. He's taking care of the kids. Like, nothing could be sexier to me than that. Right. So highly recommend that book too, if you're wanting to kind of figure out your intimacy on a new level, like figuring out what your love language is and what your spouse's love language is so cool. But I also, before we run out of time, I want to make sure that we kind of touched on it early on, but I want to come back to it a little bit before we wrap up. And it's this idea of low libido, perhaps underlying hormone imbalance issues. I wanted to share this with you. I'm not sure if you've heard this. I've heard this shared on 2 different platforms. So I'll have to link up the official PubMed research in the show notes. But it's talking about how they're finding this information now. Of course, we are a society that is, so many women are on oral contraceptives. Okay. So, and my audience knows, if they've listened to a show before, they know that oral contraceptives prevent you, for the most part, hormonal contraceptives prevent you from having fluctuations. They prevent you from ovulating. So they're in effect, sometimes suppressing your libido, because that's the purpose, is to keep you from ovulating. Right. And so I'm not here to shame oral contraceptives or birth control. There's a place for that. Absolutely. There are people that want it and require it, and that's totally cool. But understanding that these types of things can play a role in our libido, and understanding that is so cool and so key. The thing that I've been reading, this research that I've heard about and that I've been reading about, is pointing to the increase in divorce rate, the increase in separations and relationships as it pertains to women who've been on birth control. And it's kind of cool, because what it's talking about is how, because birth control is suppressing the ovulation process, and it is, as a result, suppressing the pheromones that are produced during that ovulation, that sometimes these relationships are like relationships are happening with almost like a false sense of attraction. That in a heterosexual example, a male and female are attracted to each other, but if the woman's on oral contraceptives, it could be that those oral contraceptives are sort of preventing her true pheromones from being exposed. And so the man is sort of being attracted to something that she may not actually be. When she comes off of those oral contraceptives, she has a different natural pheromones and that sort of thing. So it's really interesting to see how stuff like that plays a role. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, because I know, again, that you're a behaviorist, but I do want to just say, because again, I hear this often, I'm super dry down there, or I don't feel into it. I don't feel highly aroused. It takes me forever to become aroused, right? Like all these things that I hear often. So the one thing that I want to say, just as someone who teaches hormone health, is if you're not doing regular testing on your sex hormones, please do, right? If you are anywhere from your teenage years, early 20s, you don't feel like you have any imbalance issues, perfect. Then that's even more reason you should do the testing, because you'll be able to look at that later in life if you do have issues and compare the two. So you need the testing no matter what, especially women I see entering perimenopause, right? Their progesterone starting to decline, their libido maybe starts to decline a little bit too if there's an imbalance at play. Testing is so key, because you can look at these things, right? Your estrogen plays a role in your libido, your progesterone plays a role in your libido, and your testosterone plays a role in your libido. So if those things aren't where they should be, that's things that you can fix through supplementation, through nutrition, through lifestyle changes, in working with a functional medicine doctor. So my questions for you come down to, number one, if you have any 2 cents on that, but also what kinds of things can we be doing? Like, are there lubes that you recommend? Are there things that can help with dryness? Are there things that can help with those imbalances to help sex be more enjoyable?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about lubricants first, because I think that's one of the number one questions is like, I'm feeling really dry, for whatever reasons. And it can be because you are taking antihistamines, right? Like you have a cold, you're taking an antihistamine, it dries up your mucous membranes in your nose. It's going to dry up everywhere. It doesn't, it doesn't just target, nasal mucous membrane. So I recommend specifically for sex, not for like a vaginal lubricant, as far as like not like outside of sex. But for sex, I always recommend silicone lubricants actually, because the silicone molecule is too large to be absorbed into the vaginal tissue, into the skin. And so it really just sits on top. Like it actually provides like a pillow layer in between your vaginal canal and a toy or penis or finger, whatever's going in your vaginal canal. And then because it doesn't absorb, it all flushes back out. So it's not something that actually is absorbed into your skin at all versus, and I know we always like to say, I want to have the most natural thing. I think silicone lubricant is actually one of the best options because it doesn't get into your system. Water-based lubricants are great. And if you like water-based lubricants, go for it. But make sure you get a high quality one, the one that has a pH between 3.5 and 4.5, one that doesn't have like glycerin listed as an ingredient. You just have to be a little more careful. And there are higher and lower quality lubricants out there. So I love silicone lubricant for those reasons. Water-based lubricants, just be a little bit more particular if you're going to use water-based lubricants. A lot of people use coconut oil. It is not my favorite, you guys. You want to be like supernatural, supernatural and use coconut oil. That's great. But remember, most coconut oil, you're like putting your fingers back into the same tub over and over, and that can grow bacteria. And you're just possibly putting bacteria up into your vaginal canal. So just be careful. So as far as lubricants, that's what I recommend is actually a silicone lubricant because it will feel the most slippery and the best for you probably.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you have like ones that you recommend often, feel free to send them over to me and I can put them in the show notes. I have a couple that I can link up for people as well. One is water-based and one is silicone-based. So, but if you have any that you recommend, well, you can link that up too. But yeah, this has been such a great episode. And I just think, if you're listening to this, you clicked on it and you knew what you're getting into, right? That has sex in the title. Like you knew we were going here. We've had such a good conversation. We've come full circle, really. We've talked about intimacy. We've talked about communicating with your significant other. We've talked about libido. We've talked about, sex toys. We've talked about so much stuff. And I just think this is all stuff that needs to be talked about, right? Like this is, I want to be able to open my Instagram and have it just be the norm, right? That we're talking about sex, that we're talking about period health, that we're talking about all this stuff. And I think it is on the rise. I think women are starting to say, you know what? Enough. I'm not a small man, right? Like I'm
That's
not,
right.
I need to not be envisioned as just the smaller version of a man. Like I am a human and I am 50% of the population or whatever, like I deserve equal attention and I deserve to hear this stuff. I think you're right. Like you said this at the very beginning, like a lot of times society depicts sex as being a male pleasure thing. Like women are supposed to pleasure the man. And I know that the majority of women listening to this can say that at some point in most likely in their sexual experiences, they felt that way, that they were supposed to either look a certain way or perform a certain way, or it was supposed to feel a certain way. And here's the thing, guys. All of that can change and it's up to you to change it. Like you can listen to this and say, ooh, I don't know. Like, I don't know about any of this. Maybe you're super conservative and that's fine. But you can also look at it and say, this is an area of development for me. This is an area of improving, right? It's just like your personal development. It's just like your health. It takes intention. It takes the willingness to talk about it. It takes the willingness to admit that maybe things could become better if you worked on it, right? And so I love this. I love what you're doing. I love what you stand for and your mission. I love seeing you on social media. I want you to make sure you point everybody to how they can find you on social media and elsewhere in case they want to hear more from you. But thank you so much for being here today. If you want to just direct us where we can find you.
Yeah. Well, and back to you, Jenny. Thank you so much for being willing to have these conversations. It makes, I think, a bigger impact than you and I probably even know or can think about. But to be able to listen to conversations about sex in your earpods without, having a big sex book out while you're reading in the waiting room, podcasts, I think, are the way to go as far as getting great sex education out there. So you can find me at drcelesteholbrook.com. You can find me on Instagram at the same handle, Dr. Celeste Holbrook, Dr. Celeste Holbrook, and on Facebook at the same handle. I would love to connect with you. I do offer discovery calls if you just want to get on a call and see, how I may be able to help or how I may be able to refer you to somebody who may be able to help you. I'd love to chat. I do offer one-on-one consults, couples consults, speaking, and workshops. So if you want to get your girls together, we can do a girls' night and do some sex ed or whatever it is. If you can think it, we can build it. So I'd love to chat.
Awesome. We'll make sure to link all that up in the show notes for you guys so you can simply swipe up to get all that information. But thank you, Celeste, for being on the show today.
Yeah.
I value our friendship, and I know we'll be doing stuff. I've got to ask you back. Like, we're gonna have to go deeper.
Yes, absolutely.
We might have to have just an episode on shower sex. Like, let's just debunk.
I mean, come on.
Let's just debunk the awfulness that is shower sex. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, my friend, for being here. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Jenny.